Hello, USA. I'm nobody, just an American, and this is Just an American podcast. This is the podcast that asks the questions the mainstream media won't ask and hopefully provides solutions or offers answers that the political class won't or can't answer. So let's go forward and see what we've got for today. Before I get started, one of the things I really want to get into is the press conference that took place the other day with the president. I don't know if it struck any of you as odd because it certainly didn't appear in depth on mainstream media. But if you notice, just before the last question was asked the other day, the president just wandered around the podium and started walking towards the audience. And then he walked back and he answered the last question. And then, somewhat robotically, he walked off the stage. Now, if that movement didn't strike you as odd, it certainly struck me as being odd. But clearly, the media didn't want to report on it. Not even Fox, who typically will show you those kind of things, really showed that kind of deer in the headlight moments for the president. But it is what it is, and you've got to take it for what it is in that regard. So, with that in mind, let's get on to today's topic: the collision of three crises. And that covers three areas. It covers the border, homelessness, and COVID-19, and how all these things have come to intersect one another in our world. So the first issue is the border. The border, I'm not going to get into all aspects of the border because in some cases it's been beaten to death, and in other cases parts of it have been totally ignored. I've got two areas I really want to focus on, and I'll show you how they link to the other topics or other crises which exist in America today. So the first thing that struck me as really odd is given the inability for the current administration to house all these migrants who are now flooding into our country, I heard them announce the other day that they were going to provide $86 million for housing. 86 million taxpayer dollars to house these migrants. Well, first of all, how did they come up with 86 million? Where does that number come from? Do they even bother to tell us? And where exactly do they plan on housing them? Now, they said this was going to be used to take over hotels, etc. Well, are they taking over Motel 6 or are they taking over the Four Seasons? I don't really know, but it's $86 million. How come, by the way, it's not 100 million? Or how come it's not 25 million? And exactly how many people do they intend to house? I mean, we could try and do the math, but even if it was like $150 a day, and there were 3,000 people, and we housed them for 3 months, that number still is about $50 million. So is it many, many more migrants, or is it less? Somebody is making money in this deal, and it would be really interesting to follow the money trail. I don't know if you're curious where your tax dollars go, but I certainly want to know where my tax dollars are going, particularly in this situation when the money's going to non-Americans. The second aspect of the border, which they are beating to death, but I don't think they're beating to death in the right way, is the whole thing about the children. I hear the politicians, they come on TV, they go, the children, the children, the children, the children. Of course, most of these children say they're 15, 16, or 17 years old. Whether they are truly 15, 16, 17 years old, we don't know. But I have a question. First of all, I wonder about children who make a so-called 2,000-mile trek. What would happen to American parents if they said to their kid one day, they're living in New York, and they say to their kid one day, why don't you walk out and visit your aunt in California? You can just walk 3,000 miles, and you'll be okay, despite that you're a child. Well, that parent would be considered an unfit parent. They would probably have the child taken away from them. And yet, everyone looks with admiration on these parents, or so-called parents, in Central America and Mexico, who've just let their children go on a far more hazardous journey than one of traveling across the United States. So you got to ask yourself, what's going on there? Then the other thing is, I hear that with the majority of these children, they want to put them in the foster care system, but they're not even sure what cities they're going to send them to. But the foster care system, do you mean to tell me that the foster care system in the USA is better than having these children at home with their parents? Does that make any sense at all? I mean, seriously, they're going to be put with strangers in a foster care system rather than be sent back home with their parents. And I'm sure we all realize that if they were sent back home with their parents, and people saw that they were sent back home with their parents, this whole situation that has currently risen would come to a halt pretty quickly, or certainly the numbers would be reduced. You know, I always think about a young boy by the name of Ilion Gonzalez. Any of you remember him? Does that ring a bell? During the Clinton administration, Ilion Gonzalez, who was escaping from Cuba with his mother, and his mother perished while at sea. Young Ilion, who I believe was probably 10 or under at that point in time, stayed with relatives who were living in the Florida area. But what happened? Suddenly there was this big movement that Ilion had to go home, back to Cuba, because that's where his father was. Despite his mother's efforts to get him to a free country, suddenly they said Ilion has to go home. Not only did they say that he have to go home, and not only did they have government bureaucrats involved, they literally had our military come and take him and return him to communist Cuba. And that was okay. But now we're talking about taking children who have entered our country illegally and sending them back to their parents. Tell me what's wrong with that. Why should we put them in the foster care system instead of sending them home to their parents? It's an interesting question. The other thing that bothers me about this whole thing is, what about American kids? And this leads me to the next topic, homelessness. Do you know how many American kids are living homeless right at this moment? Have you seen the homeless encampments? Have you seen the tents on top of each other? Have you seen the needles on the ground, the drugs, the feces, the filth, all in these homeless encampments? I don't see any congressional committees rushing down to LA or San Francisco or Seattle to check out the homeless communities, to see what's going on. Do you? You know, look at Philadelphia. The other evening, Lawrence Jones was on and he was showing Philadelphia. The streets were riddled, the encampment, I should say, was riddled with hypodermic needles. And drug use was running rampant. Is this the kind of environment American kids should be growing up in? We're worried about kids from Central America taking showers every day on our border, and we don't give a crap about American kids in homeless encampments. And what's going on in these homeless encampments? Doesn't everyone wonder why on the news the homeless encampments were a big thing before COVID hit? And then suddenly COVID hits. And no one asks about the homeless encampments. Haven't you ever wondered how COVID is spreading within the homeless community? I certainly have. I mean, it's like it disappeared. One would think that COVID should be rampant. You've got people living on top of each other. This situation is despicable. The filth is everywhere. And yet we've heard no reporting on the homeless community. Except recently, an NPR did an article online. And this may really strike you as somewhat incredible. But according to a statistic put by and I'm going to get this right, so let me repeat this, homelessdeathcounts.org. So there's a group out there that actually counts the number of homeless people who die. This organization put forth a nationwide number that there have only been 343 deaths attributed to COVID within the homeless population. And the majority of those deaths took place in homeless shelters, not homeless encampments. So, what's going on there? Either COVID isn't running rampant within the homeless community, or there is a serious miscount taking place. The thing that strikes me most interesting, of course, is that the predominance of deaths are in the shelters. And on our border, we're taking kids where there has been a 10% positive test count on those tested who are COVID positive. And we're putting them in crowded shelters, way overcrowded shelters. Have you seen the pictures? They're sleeping on top of each other. And yet 10% have been tested for COVID positively. That's pretty freaking scary. You know, it's interesting. Where's the CDC in all this? How come the CDC is not on our border talking about a super spreader event? How come they're not going crazy? They certainly, the administration is certainly concerned about the fact that they didn't want the press going down to the border and inspecting the shelters for children because of the overcrowding, and they try to use COVID as an excuse. And yet, in the case of the homeless encampments, no one's going at all. Is that a little bit crazy? And you would think the CDC would get engaged, particularly on the border, because you might find this interesting, folks, but there's actually a CDC document that talks about homelessness and COVID-19 frequently asked questions. Great thing about this is the instructions to homeless people is to go online and get the information about where they can be treated and symptoms to look out for. And a very interesting one, telling the homeless people, wash your hands for 20 seconds many times during the day. Are you kidding me? How many PCs, how many iPhones have you seen at the homeless encampments? Seriously. Isn't this getting a little bit crazy? I think it is. But what we have now is we have a collision taking place. And that collision is taking place between the COVID-19 outbreak, the border crises, which shouldn't exist, which didn't exist a year ago, and a homeless crisis, which did exist a year ago, and no one did anything about anyhow. So my concern is, as nobody, just an American, that the people in charge are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I write about that, by the way, extensively in my book, I'm Nobody, Just an American. Get it. I think you'll enjoy the read. I want to thank you for joining me today. I'll be back next week. And one little aside that I'd like your participation in, if you're interested, you may notice I am wearing a Wounded Warrior Project t-shirt today. It is my hope that on future podcasts, I will be able to wear t-shirts with the names of other charities on it. And I'd like to be able to do that on a weekly basis, name a different charity that's been approved by Charity Navigator, and see if we can help those people out. It'll probably take a couple of weeks before I start getting some t-shirts in. If you'd like to participate, there are ways to contact me online or through YouTube or through Facebook. So I'd appreciate it. Thanks very much, and have a great rest of your week. Bye.